Hello, thank you all for clicking this video today. I really appreciate it. It's going to be an exciting one. We've been talking about seeing Bitcoin on Cardano for years, and I'm here with Yago today, the founder of BitcoinOS, and they have just made the largest milestone to having Bitcoin on Cardano that I've ever seen. And that was in the past couple of days. So in this podcast, we're going to learn all about that, how Bitcoin on Cardano is going to work, Bitcoin OS, and really this new milestone that was just reached. How are you doing today, Yago?
I'm great. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's exciting to talk to you again, and let's jump right into it. So can you explain more about this? I saw a headline that came out from the Bitcoin OS account that there was essentially Bitcoin on Cardano. Can we get into that?
Yeah, so we've been working for a long time to be able to make Bitcoin a system which you can do so much more with and bring programmability to Bitcoin. And one of the key ways of bringing programmability to Bitcoin is allowing other chains, which already have programmability, already have smart contracts, to interact with Bitcoin in two ways. The first way is that you would be able to write smart contracts on a chain like Cardano and have those contracts execute on Bitcoin. So actually create like a DAO which issues tokens on Bitcoin, which creates stable coins on Bitcoin, which moves BTC on Bitcoin. The second way, just as important, and ultimately they basically merge into the same thing, is the ability to take BTC and move it to other chains without having to go through a multisig or a federation or some kind of trusted, third party, but actually do it yourself. And we had a major milestone. We were able to bring a major milestone, not to testnet, but to mainnet yesterday, or sorry, 2 days ago on May 4th. What we did is our system allows for, and we can get into the details of how it does this, but we can create programmable Bitcoin. So we can basically sort of wrap BTC in programmability, creating Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network, which is programmable using ZK proofs. And then what we demonstrated was the ability to then cryptographically allow a user to move BTC from Bitcoin to Cardano in what we've been calling porting, or to make it easier for people to understand who are sort of already familiar with bridging language, bridgeless bridging. In other words, there is no bridge. You are the bridge as the user. You actually write your own transaction, moving the BTC from Bitcoin to Cardano and back. And we did this in partnership with a couple of really cool Cardano projects. So they transacted with the BTC on Cardano, and they also were able to then move the BTC back to Bitcoin. And so, I want to give a shout out to them as well. Although, this is going to be available for everyone in the Cardano ecosystem. But, Sundial participated, and ADA Handle participated in this as well.
Awesome. How did Sundial, fit into this mix? I'm curious about that. And just a little recap there. So, on May the 4th, a whole Bitcoin was brought over to Cardano, without a bridge, and then back. I think anytime something exciting happens, for better or for worse, there's always some critics that come out and say, well, actually, there was a bridge here. I saw some stuff like that. How would you respond to that?
Well, the way, so I mean, like bridge is not a dictionary definition,
Yeah.
right? But what most people are thinking about when they think about a bridge is you have like tokens on one chain, you deposit them into a system which has like a whole bunch of federated participants, like nodes or whatever. They lock up your token, and then they issue you a new token on the destination chain, right? That's not what is happening here at all. In fact, while sort of like the big story is that we've managed to move BTC to Cardano, the sort of backstory is just as exciting, which is that we have demonstrated for the first time an entirely new paradigm of cross-chain transactions, transactions that are done by the user themselves. And the way we're doing this is the programmable token on BTC. I think one way to, but what it is it's basically represented through a ZK proof, right? So the way we add the programmability is we allow you to prove ownership of the BTC, not just with a public key, but also with a ZK proof. And then what you can do as the user is you can write a transaction proof to Bitcoin saying, I am moving my BTC to a destination chain, in this case Cardano. Right now this only works with Cardano. And then on Cardano, you write the proof. You basically take that proof from Bitcoin and you write that proof to Bitcoin. And you say, here is the BTC. And when the BTC transitions and gets written to the Cardano network, it gets written to the Cardano network as a CNT. And sort of the additional part of the backstory is we've actually added new functionality to CNTs themselves. So CNTs can now be include ZK information, ZK proof, so you can actually prove off-chain things to a CNT. You can control CNTs through from other chains. So for example, with Sundial, you'll be able to control CNTs on Cardano by writing transactions on Sundial. And this will also allow CNTs to migrate to Bitcoin and to other chains. So that hasn't been developed fully yet. The first part was moving the BTC, but ultimately we want to allow these two chains to merge into basically a super chain where CNTs will be able to be migrated and begin to transact on the Bitcoin network.
What if your social profile acted like a stake pool and your followers could stake to you, generating token rewards for you both? What if these token rewards then gave you ownership and voting power in the network itself? Introducing POI, Proof of Influence, a customizable profile ecosystem that displays to the world what matters most to you. A network where its members are validated by each other, forming a community that is risk-rated and incentivized to promote good actors and highlight scammers. A network where you can vote to decide its future and how the underlying technology grows. A social ecosystem built on the most decentralized and secure blockchain network that shares its values and mirrors its design. Mint a testnet profile now on alpha.atrium.io. Complete challenges to level up your profile and receive an Atma token airdrop when it launches on mainnet. Cardano will never be the same again.
Awesome. So, on Cardano, there's this, type of technology called native scripts. And what you can do is you can essentially sign a transaction that says, I am locking this asset in my own wallet for X amount of time. And, I can't change that. No one else can change that or remove that lock. Is that what is happening on Bitcoin? Is there native scripts on Bitcoin that kind of allow you to lock that token that before it, comes to Cardano? And then, once it's on Cardano, is it, what are we inscribing to Cardano essentially? Is it that proof?
Yeah, so effectively, it's not the same thing, but it's quite similar. The logic is quite similar. So what you're doing is you're basically saying this BTC is now controlled or is now subject to ZK proofs. I need to be able to demonstrate, to prove to the Bitcoin network using ZK proofs that certain conditions have been met in order to move the BTC, right? So I'm effectively locking up the BTC. In this particular case, the proof that is required to sort of unlock the BTC is that I have a transaction, a ZK proof from Cardano saying the BTC has been moved off of Cardano and back into Bitcoin, releasing my Bitcoin back into the Bitcoin network.
That's interesting. So when you essentially have that signature on Cardano, that's what unlocks it on the Bitcoin network.
Yeah, so it's not exactly the signature in Cardano. It's the proof of the signature in Cardano.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's really exciting. So, now that we kind of,
Just, just,
have
just,
that.
just maybe, just maybe to clarify, why ZK proofs? Why are we using ZK proofs? What a
Yeah.
zero knowledge proof is it's a proof. It's the ability to prove something without being able with sort of being able to keep secret or unrevealed the underlying information. And in this particular case, the unrevealed information is the entire Cardano network. So what we're basically doing is we're giving Bitcoin eyes to see what is happening on the Cardano network, but instead of having to have visibility over the entire Cardano network, we are using ZK proofs to prove the relevant information, the relevant activity that occurred on Cardano to Bitcoin.
That's incredible. I see a lot of people kind of start to say, why would Bitcoiners use this? And, I think that there really is a huge utility for this for Bitcoiners. If you look at 2021 and you see all of the people that were essentially giving their Bitcoin to a centralized entity and locking it up to take out loans on it, and a lot of those entities kind of, went bankrupt. To me, that shows you that there is like a huge need for this. And, with that huge need that's there, why do you think we haven't seen this before? Has there been like an upgrade on Bitcoin in the past few years that's really, brought a lot of this technology to light? Because it does seem something almost inevitable. And, here we are in 2025 and we haven't seen it.
So look, this is really cutting edge. We had to do some incredibly difficult things so difficult, solve some fundamental problems that so difficult that people thought they were impossible. In fact, people, even though we've done it on chain, people still think it's impossible because you actually have to go and read through the code to actually sort of have the aha moment of wow. Um, and even then, you need sort of to have at least enough cryptographic knowledge to understand what is happening. But what we've done, first of all, would not have been possible without the Taproot upgrade 4 years ago. So Taproot introduced the ability to create much more complex cryptographic structures, basically trees of cryptographic um, data that go into a Bitcoin transaction. Without that, what we had done would have been impossible. And so even before Taproot was released, we sort of realized that this could open the door to ZK on Bitcoin. And so almost 5 years ago now, we set up a research group, and we as a team, both with internally in the team and sort of by funding external researchers, have been working on bringing ZK to Bitcoin. And over the years, we've published a number of groundbreaking papers on this. One paper that we published sort of became the paper that kicked off this whole thing that we're seeing now of building rollups on Bitcoin. Another paper that we published was how we can bring ZK and make it practical to Bitcoin without a fork. Another paper that we helped fund introduced a new way of using Taproot Merkle trees to basically bring the full, make Bitcoin effectively Turing complete. And so there's been a huge amount of work that we've been doing to build up to this point, and we're only just getting started, right? So we're still even surprising ourselves as we discover more and more capabilities that this technology has opened up for us.
Yeah, I think that you honestly have enlightened the Cardano community on a really exciting future for Bitcoin. I think that, a lot of Layer 1's focus has been, kind of competing with ETH, building the better ETH that's, cheaper, faster, and better. And I think that, you pushing this narrative kind of, changed a lot of people's opinion within the Cardano community as far as a future where we're not really just trying to compete with ETH. We're actually adding utility to Bitcoin. With that, why Cardano? I think is something that a lot of audience members would ask.
Well, Cardano is the most similar smart contract chain to Bitcoin, right? So what are we actually trying to do? We're trying to unify the entire crypto space. instead of it being a bunch of different islands that don't talk to each other and where you're moving between them, you're taking on huge risks and sort of all of these honeypot bridgers. But even worse, they're sort of not fungible, right? All of the information is trapped on different chains. Crypto today does not feel like a unified experience. It feels like a totally shattered tribal experience. And so we want to unify that around the one chain that it makes sense, that sort of is not competing with anyone and that everyone accepts, which is Bitcoin. And which is the chain that can do that best? It's Cardano. And then the second thing is that for Bitcoin, we want to bring programmability. We want to bring scalability. And again, which is the chain most similar, which is, a UTXO based chain, a chain which doesn't have frequent changes, a chain which is built not just from a technological perspective, but also from a philosophical perspective, most similarly to Bitcoin. Well, Cardano is clearly sort of the leader in that space. And so it's easier for us to build systems where your one wallet could be a Bitcoin wallet and a Cardano wallet. Your transactions could seamlessly move. Your funds could seamlessly move between these two chains. Now, eventually, over time, we will be able to also adapt other chains to this. And our plan is sort of in the first stage is to also bring chains like Doge and Litecoin and sort of what we've been calling the UTXO brothers all together into sort of the super chain of crypto. And this will have huge advantages over sort of the Ethereum paradigm. The Ethereum paradigm, I think everyone can see right now, is really, really struggling, and it should be. It does not scale. It shoves too much into the chain. The account-based system is inferior to the UTXO system. So there were a lot of decisions that they made, architectural decisions, which were sort of move fast and break things decision, and now the things are starting to break. But the big winner is clearly Bitcoin. And those chains which are going to be best able to integrate with Bitcoin are those chains which are most closely architecturally and philosophically aligned to Bitcoin. And so Litecoin and Cardano are two obvious players there. And I think that what this means for Cardano is that Cardano is going to be able to do two things. One, play an extremely important role as a hub of activity for Bitcoin. Right? There's just this, as you mentioned, there's this huge demand now, growing all the time, for people to be able to do more with their BTC, and also do more with the Bitcoin chain. Right? Real world assets on Bitcoin, stable coins on Bitcoin, treasury assets on Bitcoin. We saw sort of like an early spark of this with BRC20 tokens and ordinals, but the demand to use the world's best ledger as a ledger is huge. And Cardano can play an extremely important role as the provider of compute to that network. And then as we expand this, Cardano can go further and sort of act as like the compute center for this super chain of Bitcoin, Litecoin, Doge, Cardano, and other UTXO chains, and then ultimately for all of crypto.
So does BitcoinOS kind of also serve as this, middle layer chain? One thing I wanted to mention as well is out of the chains that you mentioned, this UTXO Brothers Alliance, none of those other chains have, smart contracts. So Cardano does kind of play a pivotal role there. And getting into, BitcoinOS, kind of this uniting entity, between the different chains. How does that play in? Is it kind of like its own chain that lives as the middleware between these chains? What is BitcoinOS?
So I'm glad you're asking me that question, because everything that we've seen up until now has been what I call the blockchain paradigm. People thought that in order to build value, you need to sort of launch your own blockchain. And so as a result, today we have, 10,000 blockchains. But Bitcoiners have always said that that doesn't make sense. In fact, even talking about blockchains doesn't make sense. A blockchain is like a carburetor. It's just like a piece of tech that helps your system work. And what is the system? Nobody says today I bought a Mercedes carburetor. What they bought is the Mercedes car. right? What you're using is not a blockchain. What you're using is a ledger. And so what the ledger provides is a settlement system, a record system for assets, and the security for all of that. So to come back to your question, we are not building a new chain. What we're building is actually embedding this information into Bitcoin and into the chains that integrate with Bitcoin through BOS, so that these systems become interrelated, tightly integrated. So no, BOS is not a chain at all. It's the reason we call it the BitcoinOS is it's an operating system. It's an operating system for developers who want to integrate tightly with Bitcoin and bring new scalability, throughput, and functionality to Bitcoin.
Okay. Yeah, I think you raise a very fair point there. We are just interacting with a ledger, just a chain of transactions. And I hadn't really thought about it in that way. So, kind of expanding on this, operating system, thought here, how do these developers kind of decide ultimately which chain to use? If BitcoinOS is, using Cardano to kind of expand, Bitcoin's technology, is it essentially just up to the developer? You guys are building software that allows developers to choose what tool they want to use. And, essentially, these different tools are different, kind of ledgers with their own utility.
Yeah. Our goal here is to actually make that question obsolete. So it's very, very strange that in crypto, you kind of like need to decide where you're going to launch your application. If you're building for the internet, you don't like say, I'm going to launch my application on GoDaddy, or I'm going to launch my application on America Online. You launch your application on the internet, and then it's available to everyone. But that doesn't work in crypto today. What we're doing with this tight integration of these different systems is we're making a system where a developer can build once, deploy once, serve everyone. And so we are helping crypto to start to look more like the internet and actually to merge with the internet. And if we do our jobs right, in the future, nobody will be talking about blockchains. In the same way that nobody talks about, I don't know, IP network, right? They just go online. They don't even talk about the internet so much anymore. You just go online, you use Google, so people will just be using MinSwap, or they'll just be using Handle, or they'll just be using whatever it is that they're using. And developers will be able to serve the entire world with a single deployment and a single deployment that they need to maintain.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like when you're going to launch your blockchain, you don't choose TCP/IP. You're like, that's the internet that I'm working with here. Okay, that definitely makes sense. With that obsolescence, so someone would essentially just, I'm trying to wrap my head around it in its entirety, right? So, let's say you want to build a platform on Bitcoin, right? Let's say you're building a platform where people can, essentially provide a stable coin as liquidity, and then they're earning some yield, from this for providing the liquidity. And then people with Bitcoin can come in, they can deposit Bitcoin as collateral, and then take out some of that stable coin liquidity because they've put in that Bitcoin collateral, right? What are they writing in? Like how do they write in this software? Like how can you kind of make that decision making obsolete?
So with BOS, we already have developers writing using TypeScript, using Rust, basically using just standard programming languages, the programming languages you would use to write anything that you're building to be connected to the internet. So instead of learning a special language to write dApps, you just write an application using whatever language you're comfortable with. And we can do this because the sort of secret sauce behind these capabilities is that we take big, expensive, complicated compute, and we condense that compute and into a proof, into a zero-knowledge proof, which can now be written to different chains and can especially be written to Bitcoin, allowing that all of that computation to become Bitcoin computation, right? So if you think about what a smart contract chain is, or even what a smart contract is, a smart contract is just verified compute. And the Ethereum paradigm of smart contracts was you take the entire piece of code and the entire VM and all of the data, and you shove that into the blockchain, and then every single node and every single verifier needs to rerun every single computation independently, right? So everyone is rerunning every single thing. So instead of being a world computer, it's the whole world running one calculator. And that's extremely redundant, and that's the reason it doesn't scale. So instead, what we're doing is we're allowing you to build modular smart contracts where the assets exist in the ledger on Bitcoin, and the compute exists somewhere else, in this case, in Cardano. And so that's a really, really tight coupling, right? So Cardano can now manipulate assets on Bitcoin, and assets can move between those two environments seamlessly.
Okay, so essentially the translation language is the actual proof, between all of these chains. That's how you're able to write in, say, TypeScript.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So long as you are able to prove your computation, and we already, are able to do basically all RISC-V languages, and soon we'll be able to do WASM as well, which basically will mean every single language, every single common language that a developer could choose to write in, you can write your application in, and it will become something that you can use in this super network.
Awesome. So, kind of now that we, have seen this this first milestone, not first milestone, but a big milestone that's been crossed here, what is the future rollout of, Bitcoin on Cardano and ultimately other chains, and, kind of this utility that you're bringing to, developers in our space? What's the next year look like?
So we're currently working with some of the wallet projects um, to integrate Boss with them, so that Cardano wallets will now be able to transact with Bitcoin and with Cardano and between those two chains. That is a first step to the rollout, right? So as we get this integrated with wallets, it will become possible for regular users to begin to use this. So like the transactions that we did now were basically all done through command line, which is not the way most users are going to want to transact. And so we need this additional abstraction layer of the wallets. And then at the same time, getting it integrated into different applications. So for example, the DEXs, the lending pools, like ADA handle, like the ability to buy handles, all of that will now expand to being able to use BTC to be. You'll be able to write a smart, like let's say you want to create a Bitcoin-backed stablecoin. You'll be able to write a smart contract on Cardano, which will see whether or not BTC has been locked up on Bitcoin. Use that BTC that has been locked up on Bitcoin as collateral, and then against that collateral issue stable coins on Bitcoin, on Cardano, on Sundial, on Litecoin, and eventually on Ethereum or BSC or anything.
Okay. So that's really a big part of Bitcoin OS is using Bitcoin to issue stable coins, for all ecosystems, you would say.
I think that's going to be a very big use case. I think there's going to be, as there's increasing demand for stablecoins, there's also going to be increasing demand for stablecoins that no one can, that are uncensorable. And Bitcoin is a very obvious, probably the most obvious collateral asset for these stablecoins. But I also think that that is just one of many use cases. right now, one of the primary things that we're seeing is very, very um, so Bitcoin holders, big and small, and but especially the big ones, are very interested in being able to, without taking on additional counterparty risk, begin to generate yield on their Bitcoin. And so what they're really looking for is Bitcoin native DeFi. And by having this close integration between Cardano, which already has a DeFi ecosystem and is basically looking for liquidity, and Bitcoin, which has a huge amount of liquidity, which is looking for DeFi, I think you could very rapidly see extreme growth in basically Cardano DeFi.
Yeah. When Cardano DeFi first launched, the smart contracting language, it took, quite some time for tooling to develop around that and the developer experience to really, increase, right? To make it, easier for people to develop apps or, build any type of software. And I think that, Cardano DeFi, at least over the past year and a half, has really started maturing in terms of developer experience. And I think that that's really going to be ultimately a great benefit to Bitcoiners in this regard. At least, we're on Cardano, like most chains, I think that we're in our own echo chamber sometimes, and it's always important to kind of reach out into the wider community. I'm curious on how, you've found, saying this, out loud to the Bitcoin community and the Ethereum community, considering, there kind of is this maximalist approach of, Cardano is a shit coin essentially, or, anything but Bitcoin is just shit coin. It takes a lot of courage, I imagine, to, kind of go out there and say, we are using Cardano to expand Bitcoin. How have you found that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, we've taken a lot of shit.
Yeah.
We've taken a lot of shit from Bitcoiners. We've taken a lot of shit from other people. Taken a lot of shit from the Cardano community.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
um, um, yeah, I think anytime you do something new, you're gonna take a lot of shit. People don't like new. People are, especially if it sort of breaks their framework, their whatever framework they have about thinking about the world. If you're doing something which sort of is outside of that framework, it feels wrong somehow. Um, but that's mostly Twitter, and Twitter is not a real place. What is real is we've seen uh, we've been talking to and been approached by so many Bitcoin holders, representing vast amounts of Bitcoin, that are looking for ways to put that Bitcoin to work. That is real. And they are much more hard-nosed about this. Now, not everyone. People are going to want to see things live. They're going to want to make sure that it's secure. People want to be able to get comfortable with something. And so it's not like you launch something and then the next day $100 billion are deposited. It's a ramp up. And as people see things are working, they dip their toes in. As they see that that's working and that they're earning and that it's secure, they dip a little bit more. That's the adoption process. But the demand is very, very real, and the demand cares whether or not it will work. It's really the loud people on Twitter who are tribal. The vast majority of people are much more rational and much more utilitarian when it comes to their funds.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with that. As soon as you shut off Twitter for the weekend, your blood pressure goes down a little bit, and you find that there is a whole nother world out there that may be more based in reality. So, I think some of the audience here, they may have never heard of Midgard or Sundial. So I want to dive into that little piece a little bit. You said that you mentioned you guys use Sundial to bring the Bitcoin over to Cardano. From my understanding, Sundial is a layer two, right, that brings ZK proof functionality to Cardano, and it's being built, using the Midgard technology. Is that correct?
Hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
we didn't use Sundial. Sundial isn't even on testnet yet. What
Okay.
happened was that the Sundial team used Boss's tools to transact with the BTC. And
Oh,
this is really important to them because what Sundial want to be able to build is sort of a BTC optimized environment, basically a layer two for Cardano that specializes in Bitcoin. And what Boss does is it really enables that mission to be accomplishable.
okay. That's really interesting. And you think that that specialization is needed due to, kind of constraints of scaling, you would think, with Cardano at the layer one.
It's not just scaling, it's also specialization will allow for better UX and concentrating liquidity. So there are products that you can build. If you build out an ecosystem which is specially designed for Bitcoin, you can build out the products to be specifically designed for Bitcoin. You can build out user interfaces which automatically generate keys from the Bitcoin public key. So basically, you could use Bitcoin wallets on a Cardano layer 2 for your transactions. And you can make Bitcoin native assets native to Sundial. Um, so, we haven't spoken a lot about this, but we're going to be releasing a white paper very soon, probably next week, detailing an entirely new way of using Bitcoin as a general purpose ledger, where you'd be able to have any asset on Bitcoin, not just BTC. And so Sundial can be a specialist in basically treating those as first class assets. So um, so I think the advantage of specialization is actually more around liquidity concentration and UX.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I actually did, a private, 1 hour call, kind of around that. And it's something I'm really excited for. We'll do another podcast maybe with the developer around that time to kind of dive deeper into how that technology works. But, it definitely excited me. I kind of dug into it, learned more about it. And, for the audience, essentially, native CNTs would be able to be on Bitcoin, and Bitcoin tokens would be able to be on Cardano in a trustless way. So I look forward to kind of diving more into that, but we'll give the audience some time to kind of learn all of this first. So kind of diving into the transaction again a couple of days ago. When I was looking at it, it looked like kind of like a UTXO in, right? And this is kind of the first version of it, but that would kind of allow someone, if they don't, you mentioned you're working with wallet creators, you can accidentally spend, a UTXO considering the transaction is not constructed correctly. Is the solution to this for there kind of be, a smart contract that sits there and accepts all of these UTXOs in and says, hey, you can't spend these UTXOs. And then once it receives it, it kind of generates that Bitcoin out of it. Is that kind of how you see the long-term functionality here? Or, are there other kind of ways of looking at this?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What is the problem is the problem that people can lose their BTC by making an unstructured transaction?
Essentially, yes. When I was
Yeah,
looking at,
I don't think the solution to that is a smart contract. I think the
okay,
solution to that is um, a check in the wallet, right? So the wallet itself, every good wallet should be checking to make sure that the transaction that you're trying to send is correctly structured and should
yeah.
only send correctly structured transactions. This is something that can happen entirely on your own device. You don't need a smart contract for it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And, that's why it's important to kind of work with wallets and create that standard, as you mentioned earlier. I just, I was kind of brainstorming, solutions, and I
Yeah.
kind of wanted to run it by you. I was curious.
But what
Awesome.
you could do with smart contracts is you can create um, more, you can create um, uh, tradition conditional transactions. So, for example, you could say, never allow more than a certain amount to be transacted from my wallet at any given time in case my wallet gets hacked. Or you could say, this wallet is this, these funds are for my child, so only release them in 18 years. Or you could create rules around who can inherit your Bitcoin if it doesn't move for 5 years, for example. So in the case of, it's basically like an online will. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can do, and those you could build in with conditional transactions and smart contract functionality.
Yeah. And I honestly think that, as you were mentioning kind of earlier about terminology around bridges and blockchains, I think that we also are a bit tainted, with the Ethereum view of smart contracts, right? Because, on receiving that UTXO, there could be a native script, that has no third party. It is truly decentralized. It's the person themselves signing it that says, hey, I'm not allowed to send this. Whereas like when people hear the word smart contract, they think of like the billions of dollars of Ethereum hacks, from liquidity pools and stuff. So, I like, that you're kind of taking that approach of education around kind of stripping out some of these, terms that we have. But I really enjoyed the podcast today. It was very informational. Is there anything that, we didn't cover today before we get out of here that you think is important to tell the audience about essentially?
Well, I think, look, there's pretty exciting stuff coming. We're going to be publishing a new white paper, which is going to be, among other things, how you can use Bitcoin as a general purpose ledger, but also how this can allow assets that originate from Bitcoin to be CNTs. A lot of people have been asking us about the BOSS token itself, which will be you'll be able to have it as a CNT, and so BOSS will be a CNT, and then also there's a campaign that we're about to start, specifically for Cardano communities, to learn more about BOSS and actually start getting a feel for BOSS. And so I would suggest checking out the BOSS Twitter and particularly the BOSS Discord, because that I think is so that's going to be starting today, and there's going to be some cool questing and prizes for the Cardano community.
Awesome. I'll have all of those links down below for everybody, so you guys can just go directly to them. And I one thing I want to say is I have seen kind of some shade thrown your way, and I think that you guys have handled it very well. We did that 3-hour Twitter space, probably 4 months ago, where every second there's somebody new coming up to grill you, and I think you handled it with courage. You handled it really well, and I'm excited to see people have a focus on pushing innovative technology, writing papers about it, and coming up with unique ways to change this industry. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for anybody that are watching. If you made it to the end, type in OS and then Bitcoin second, so we know you made it till the end. And we hope you all have a good rest of your week.
Thank you very much, bigpey, and thanks for everyone who listened.
See you guys.